So about a year ago, I came across this TikTok that made me cry laughing. It was a clip of two sassy 20-somethings laughing about a stan Twitter interaction. You see, a Barb was attacked out in the wild by a K-pop stan, misusing a meme to rewrite a sentence, which inevitably led to the phrase, Onika Burgers.
Whoever
I
came
what
up
we're
with
talking
that,
about because we sound fucking crazy.
whoever, like, I want you on the pod because I love the way you see the world in your mind works. Like, that was so
I need
special.
to pick your brain.
Yeah.
The podcast, as it turns out, is called Emergency Intercom. I didn't know that at the time. I only found out recently when they became embroiled in controversy over their comments about one Greta Thunberg, or Greta Thunberg. I think I'm just going to say it the American corny way for the sake of me sounding less pretentious. I didn't think about this. On March 28th, Emergency Intercom released an episode called Things Are Changing, wherein they comment that Greta Thunberg fell the fuck off.
You know who else fell off? Greta Thunberg. That bitch is in the gutters, bitch. Like, sorry, bitch. Like, her legacy being lesbian, and I shouldn't be up here is
The thing is,
so perfectly what's wrong with everything in this world, because like she literally was that girl. She was like fighting for climate change.
Her saying she shouldn't be up there, like, you're right, you should be in school, and your parents kind of suck for not letting you just go to school and be fucking normal. Like, go to school, be normal, and then you can like but poor girl, she was fighting for a cause that she felt so strong for.
I think
but
she's
like,
still fighting for it, but in like 20 years she'll probably
fighting
be
where? Because
president.
I don't see her.
Their comments were widely panned, with a recent TikTok edit going viral, juxtaposing their comments over footage of Thunberg's recent activism, particularly her work in Palestine, as well as footage of the ongoing genocide there. Now, it's rare to see a comment section exercise such sharp critique and disgust with a content creator who the comments apparently had a strong parasocial relationship with prior, especially over a political issue. I mean, I feel like this goes to show that people these days are more and more willing to call out content creators for political issues. I know people have been talking about this for years now, but it seems like we've properly normalized that, and I like that. I think a lot of people should learn from that, honestly. But even though there is some merit to some of the comments about Drew and Enya, this is the name of the people on the show, being stuck in their LA bubble, which they've relocated to, and all of the money getting to their head, I think these are not the only things we should point to in terms of why they would make comments like this, why they would be misinformed about Greta. I think the roots of this are in a media machine that has abandoned coverage of one of its former darlings and the economic considerations underpinning those actions. In this video, I will chronicle the rise of Greta Thunberg, a cultural icon of the late 2010s, and examine the problem-filled coverage that she received even back then. After which I will examine how her career in activism has developed over time, how she has shifted to examining climate change as related to colonialism and capitalism, and how this shift in her career correlated with a decline in coverage. After this, we're going to talk a bit about some existing scholarship on how climate change is undeniably connected with capitalism, with colonialism, with genocide, things you're seeing on your IG feeds, and that'll help clarify Greta's shift in her activism. I'll then use this to critique some popular narratives about how climate change is actually a human-centered apolitical issue, which is something that still pervades climate change discourse in certain circles on the internet to this day, as well as provides a justification for why Greta's coverage has declined. Finally, I'll return to the issue of the Emergency Intercom podcast and discuss how it's important to raise your voice still. I know it sounds cheesy, but just follow me here. We're going to go on a ride. We're going to talk about Greta. Bloom! This video is sponsored by Rocket Money. Given current events, I am especially right now focusing on figuring out where I'm putting my money and figuring out what I can save on. There's different questions of which streaming apps I really need to be using, and whether or not I actually canceled that subscription to that one publication that I don't really read anymore. And that's where Rocket Money is here to help. Rocket Money is an easy to use app that helps you save more and manage your money better. Using all the app's premium features, Rocket Money users have saved up to $740 a year. It helps you set budgets and it helps you automate your savings. All these things are very valuable to my wonderful audience, I'm sure. So if you want to get started on saving some money and you need some help, check out Rocket Money. That's rocketmoney.com/ElliotSang to get started for free. Thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video, and let's get to it.
Nimenion Greta Thunberg. Olen 15 vuotias. Asun Tukholmassa. Olen kuololakossa ilmaston puolesta.
The first thing I want to say is that Greta Thunberg's coverage in mainstream media has always been problematic. It placed undue importance on a young girl, 15 years of age during her rides in 2018, as this type of savior figure, or a leadership figure of a supposed savior generation in Gen Z, which was always a little bit of a backhanded title setting up this particular generation for failure. What else is new? Last year, I covered how Gen Z became a focal point for political unrest in Kenya under the dictatorial president, let's say, William Ruto. And this is far from the only instance. As recent as February, Gen Z was at the front lines of significant political protests in Indonesia. It's like people are seeing Gen Z on the other side of political conflict. This moment of uprooting things and political change sees Gen Z on the outside, protesting the powers that be and the status quo. Yet, in the global north, narratives are shifting, even among people on the left, which is bothering me a little bit, seeing Gen Z as this potentially extra repressive, extra conservative generation, mainly based on votes in the 2024 US presidential election, shifting, though not switching, to have more votes for Donald Trump, as well as dubious surveys that went viral early in 2025 that suggest that young people in Britain are allegedly more into fascism. Of course, there's a lot of conversations that we can have about reactionary movements that do often prey on young, especially men, but it feels a bit of a shift, doesn't it? It feels like we can't just go from, hey, Gen Z is going to save the world, they're the most progressive generation ever, and then now we're talking about Gen Z is actually going to ruin the world because they're so conservative. Something happened, right? Like, this comes years after the rise of Greta Thunberg, which was met with popular rhetoric about Gen Z being particularly progressive and activistic. Oh, the kids are all right. UNESCO went as far as to coin the term Generation Greta, noting other teenage activists around the world kind of following in her stead. What I basically believe at this point is that Greta Thunberg and Gen Z were set up for failure by the mainstream media, were put forth as this savioristic generation, and that pedestal allows it to be even more easy to target Gen Z when it doesn't seem to live up to those expectations. That being said, who is Greta Thunberg? And who was she to these large organizations and media entities? Born in Stockholm in 2023 to an actor and an opera singer, Thunberg tells the story of her radicalization as one connected to her own mental health struggles. She learned about climate change when she was 8 and fell into a deep depression, after which she was eventually diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, OCD, and selective mutism.
I remember thinking that it was very strange that humans, who are an animal species among others, could be capable of changing the Earth's climate. Because if we were, and if it was really happening, we wouldn't be talking about anything else. If burning fossil fuels was so bad that it threatened our very existence, how could we just continue like before?
After some time of continuously urging her parents to take more steps to reduce climate harm, such as upcycling and going vegan, Thunberg got the idea to begin striking for climate change after seeing other youth protests against school shootings, notably the massacre at Parkland High School in 2018. And so, famously in August of that year, Greta Thunberg began the school strike for climate. In the wake of wildfires in Sweden at that time, which emitted the country's hottest summer ever at that time. I actually haven't checked as to whether that record has been broken. I suspect it has. Greta began sitting by herself with her school strike for climate sign on the steps of Swedish parliament. Now, a great deal of Greta's messaging at that time centered on Sweden being overly praised as a country that was not a role model, not a green paradise, and in fact, reflecting a global tendency to believe that we can solve crises without effort, without sacrifice.
No one is acting as if we were in a crisis. Even most climate scientists or green politicians keep on flying around the world, eating meat and dairy.
But maybe the rhetorical move that she did that caught the most attention, that brought her the most popularity and legacy in international media, was her blunt expression of disgust towards older generations. Every day for 2 weeks, Thunberg has been sitting quietly on the cobblestones outside Parliament in central Stockholm, handing out leaflets that declare, "I am doing this because you adults are shitting on my future." That was from a piece from The Guardian. I want you to note how much that becomes the focus of the narrative that Greta puts forth, even though it's not necessarily all that she was saying at all. The thing that the media and that adults around the world were the most compelled by was this image that Greta was kind of putting forth of this divide of young people facing a world that was ruined by old people. After the first week where she protested by herself, more and more people started to join her slowly, and then things exploded. She went viral, people are covering her all over the world, and soon climate protests began that were led by students all over the world. By the end of that year, 2018, she was giving speeches at climate rallies in Europe. Her speech in December of that year at the UN Climate Change Conference went viral, which was one of numerous that would see such results. Now, given all that she had accomplished in terms of raising her profile and having this big influence, she had a lot of reasons, Greta Thunberg, to be excited and proud of herself at the start of 2019. But I think that this journey actually radicalized her further and made her more and more cynical about, no pun intended, the environment that she was in. For instance, in 2018, when her activism is getting started, Thunberg collaborates with We Don't Have Time, a climate startup that runs a for-profit, climate-focused social media network, who invited her to sit on a youth advisory board. Now, at first, she might not even be able to tell that this company is a for-profit. You might think it's a non-profit because it has this kind of non-profit ethos and aesthetic about it. It cares about the climate and getting information out there. The majority shareholder of this company calls itself a foundation, and the company presents itself as the world's largest media platform for climate action, and advertises to prospective subscribers to join the platform, and will plant a tree. Well, I'll do it. However, in early 2019, it was revealed that We Don't Have Time had used Thunberg's name 11 times in a financial prospectus it released to prospective shareholders, all without informing Greta or her family first. Local reporting also found that this company channels just 10% of its profits to a charitable fund and says it has potential to be extremely profitable by creating viral environmental contents to pull in money via digital adverts. And I think this incident foreshadows just how fluffy, advantageous, and shallow much of the Greta Thunberg hype train was. Through no fault of her own, she was scammed in a sense in this instance. Greta was resolute, not only in talking about how older generations ruin the world, but in talking about the extractive dynamics of climate change.
Our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue making enormous amounts of money. Our biosphere is being sacrificed so that rich people in countries like mine can live in luxury.
But her message was so often co-opted by various institutions who were more interested in reinforcing the old school narrative. One of the children needing to be saved, but also don't worry because the children will save themselves. That way, people are able to be both morally self-congratulatory and also abdicate themselves of any responsibility to act. I'll explain further. So in order to reach a climate conference in New York, the UN Climate Action Summit, as well as the scheduled UN Climate Change Conference in Chile, Greta set sail in line with her anti-flight stance, avoiding a larger carbon blueprint by taking to the seas. And this required her to take a sabbatical year from school. So this is the big 2019 of Greta Thunberg. So she goes on a boat, gets to New York, and in New York at the Climate Action Summit, she gives probably her most famous speech.
I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you?
Out of context, it appears a passionate confirmation of the narrative, the message she'd already been sending. The adults, the grown-ups, are fucking up. But the mood of the summit was gesturing towards action. Previous speakers like UN leader Antonio Guterres spoke of the anger of nature lashing out at humanity. The crowd was whooping at Paloma Costa as she called for action, action, action.
I saw the whole world praying for our forests and our indigenous people fighting for survival. We don't need praying, we need acting.
The aims of the conference were to put pressure on world leaders to act in accordance with the Paris climate agreements, themselves far too weak, of course. I mean, they had these lofty goals to meet less than 1.5 Celsius increases in global temperatures within 70 years. We are on track to pass that by the 2030s. But anyway, getting people to get even there was the task of this conference. And by now you know Greta's famous line as she steps up to bat. "You all come to us young people for hope. How dare you?" Her voice is wispy and full of rage. She sounds like she's on the verge of tears. It's really evocative. And yes, that was like the speech heard around the world at the time. But let's think about the context of where this ended up. Of course, there's how little it fazed the brazen president of the US. Wonder whatever happened to that guy. And how even the ensuing election of Joe Biden and his immediate return to the Paris agreements still ended up with us being, the US, the largest producer of oil in the world at the end of his tenure. But of course, this conference in and of itself did get a lot of people to make commitments. Let's talk about what those commitments were. A lot of those commitments were essentially commitments to commit. Commitments to create conferences or join conferences in which people will decide what they can commit to do. For example, Chilean President Sebastián Piñera created a climate alliance, the goal of which was to increase commitments. Do you see where I'm going here? Dozens of countries pledged to cut greenhouse gases to zero by 2050, which at that point, a lot of the damage has already been done. I can already hear the resist libs in the comments talking about, well, at least it was something, I mean, I hope that the billion people that end up getting killed by climate crises can feel that that's a good consolation prize for their troubles. Greta, our friend, was witnessing firsthand the bureaucratic avoidance central to the world system and its continuous destruction of our environment. And when you think about this viral speech, about Greta's statements that young generations will never forgive these older generations and particularly their lawmakers, rather than being met with a room full of haunted adults that were moved to change their behaviors, it was met with a room of adults cheering.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you!
They cheered and laughed and whooped more as a child told them to fuck off, to be ashamed of themselves, because those in the room knew that the prestige of the United Nations and the sentimental value of their words about progress would be enough to clear their own consciences. Now, the climate change conference in Chile for that year was moved to Spain after sweeping protests broke out in the country against Piñera's regime, calling for a new constitution and an end to the cost of living crisis. Danae, how's that been going? I assume the constitution has been ratified and the cost of living crisis in Chile is over. You let me know though. I'm sure you got a lot to say. Thunberg spoke there in Spain as well as at several other conferences. The procedure was always the same. Okay, crowds cheered, attention soared, and then everyone quietly went back to business as usual. Greta's career had become the equivalent of Huey Freeman's situation in The Pilot of the Boondocks. Adults with money and power clapping for the radical speech of the children as a piece of entertainment.
They're rich. No matter what happens, these people just keep applauding.
Boy, this kid is so smart, isn't she? She's really gonna change things. Anyway, about drilling. Greta was selected as Time Magazine's 2019 Person of the Year. And the feature that Time ran and the quotes that you can get from this article embodied this dynamic perfectly. "We can't just continue living as if there was no tomorrow, because there is a tomorrow," she says, tugging on the sleeve of her blue sweatshirt. "That is all we are saying. It's a simple truth, delivered by a teenage girl in a fateful moment." For decades, researchers and activists have struggled to get world leaders to take the climate threat seriously. But this year, an unlikely teenager somehow got the world's attention. The politics of climate action are as entrenched and complex as the phenomenon itself, and Thunberg has no magic solution. I mean, she is saying that we should stop the fucking profit motive. You know, there are some pretty obvious changes that we could start making. You know, stop drilling for oil so much. Maybe don't do that as much. This paragraph is very telling, but the needle is moving. Fortune 500 companies facing major pressure to reduce their emissions are realizing that sustainability makes for good PR. In June, the airline KLM launched a Fly Responsibly campaign, which encouraged customers to consider abstaining from non-essential air travel. Yeah, good idea. I was planning to fly like 6 times this month so that I could see different seashells and different beaches and compare them, but maybe I'll cut it down to 2. In July, the head of OPEC, the cartel that controls much of the world's oil production, called climate strikers the greatest threat to his industry, according to the AFP. That's actually kind of significant. That hasn't changed either. In September, workers at Amazon, Facebook, and other major companies walked out during the climate strikes. Very good. And in November, the president of Emirates Airline told the BBC that the climate strikers helped him realize we are not doing enough. Oh, brother. In December, Klaus Schwab, the founder and the CEO of the World Economic Forum, published a manifesto calling on global business leaders to embrace a more responsible form of capitalism that, among other things, forces companies to act as a steward of the environmental and material universe for future generations. Despite the continuous platitudes offered towards Greta and her impact, the Time magazine piece, much like the other coverage that Greta received, ultimately puts her in this savior position. God, nobody had thought to alert businesses about climate change until this one teenage girl did it. One girl changed the world. It highlights her as some amazing nonviolent protester that's just affecting change through rhetoric. But then you look at the change that people are talking about doing, and it's just like world leaders going, you know, you're right. Maybe we should take care of the planet. I can't emphasize enough. It's this savior narrative that also becomes a useful tool against a generation. Aside from the long-standing criticisms that Greta's received from mostly the right, but across the political spectrum since her breakout success, about her being too young, about her being naive or performative, etc., this kind of commentary about a generation also puts it in an impossible position to achieve goals by a certain time. Or else reinforce the idea that protesting and speaking up are pointless. The narrative was never, oh, Greta Thunberg is one of many teenagers using their voice, one of the few things that they can use to raise awareness, because these world leaders are not doing enough, and they're lying and saying they're going to do more, but they're not doing more. It's never attention being paid towards the actual actors that could actually change things. It's always these platitudes toward this idea that if one teenage girl just steps up and tries her best, then it's going to change the world. But that's not how it's worked. It's not how it could ever possibly work. She's not the one doing the drilling. She's not doing the fucking oil spills. It's you guys.
I've given many speeches and learned that when you talk in public, you should start with something personal or emotional to get everyone's attention. But today I will not do that, because then those phrases are all that people focus on. They don't remember the facts, the very reason why I say those things in the first place.
And of course it sets Greta up to be seen as this hypocrite. Oh, the jacket that she's wearing in this one photo shoot is wool. We shouldn't listen to anything she has to say. It even works across a generation at this point. Well, they said that they were gonna be progressive and change the world, but look, some of them are voting for Trump, so I guess that was all a lie. What the hell are y'all even talking about? But that's how we went from Gen Z is saving the world, smiley face, to Gen Z is destroying the planet single-handedly. They are more conservative than any generation that has ever existed. Of course, young people are reacting to social crises. They affect young people's lives the most because they're not economically established like older generations are, because they have their whole lives to look forward to. But a lot of adults have been doing this work for many years and have not been listened to. And a lot of young people are reacting to those social crises in a myriad of different ways. We could look at younger generations as people just stepping into a world that's already been molded for them and reacting to it in turn, or we could look at them as either good or bad. And we do the latter because the former would require that we humanize children, and we'd never do that. Regardless, Greta Thunberg, who is a person that seems to have an actual conscience and curiosity, soon began to turn against the very machine that made her into a hero.
No more exploitation, no more blah blah blah. No, whatever the fuck they're doing inside there.
So the Wikipedia page chronicling Greta Thunberg's biggest speeches cuts off at the end of 2021. Why is that? Let's do a look. Let's examine the last speech it lists. At COP26, the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, Greta Thunberg officially turned on the UN system. Rather than give her speech on stage at the conference as she had in years past, Thunberg spoke outside of it, at a rally organized by Fridays for Future Scotland, which was of course inspired by Thunberg's Fridays for Future protests. The rally targeted a COP26 described as the most exclusionary climate summit ever. One spokesperson said that the event would go down as the worst planned, worst organized, and least effective COP that I have ever known, noting that 1/3 of the usual number of participants representing the Global South had been able to attend COP26 due to COVID-19 restrictions, a lack of affordable accommodation, and an inability to access the conference. Youth climate activist Alexandria Villaseñor tweeted that there was one entrance for 20,000 attendees. It's like a single file line for everyone to get in and get through security. I've spent 4 hours in line over the past 2 days. It's chaos and a failure on the part of the organizers. Even aside from the obvious logistical issues that reflect poor event planning, the failures of the event reflect larger failures and trends in climate action. Katie Lederer's piece for N+1, Cop Out, tackled the rhetorical shift which had become ubiquitous, the type of stuff that Thunberg's Time feature was littered with. Ambitious action, time for action, bold climate action to fight climate change. This sort of language is used in heavy rotation every year when delegates from almost every nation meet for the COP. Lederer gives us some background on the term COP. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. According to the website of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, known by the deeply uncharismatic acronym of UNFCCC, the COP is the supreme decision-making body of the convention and is tasked with achieving the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Its framework is based on the one that produced the Montreal Protocol, the agreement put together to address the growing hole in the ozone layer. But unlike the Montreal Protocol, which was ultimately successful, the results of the COP have been a bust. Then she notes some previous COPs and their results. Famous COPs have included Kyoto, number 3, which the US refused to ratify and from which then President George W. Bush withdrew in 2001, Copenhagen, number 15, which tanked when the US and other large economies failed to hammer out a deal, and of course Paris, number 21, where in a show of audacious optimism, world leaders set the goal of keeping warming well below a 2°C threshold, the widely received baseline. This after 20 years of failed negotiations. And yet, as the markets for low-carbon technology and energy efficiency have grown, fossil fuel interests have come over the top. Last year, for the first time, the United States became the world's biggest global oil and gas producer, bigger than Saudi Arabia, bigger than Russia. This was in the late part of the Trump administration, the first one, which had a policy of energy dominance. And under such, the Trump administration had been dismantling Obama-era climate safeguards and pushing the aggressive exportation of American fossil fuels. More on those Obama-era safeguards in a bit. Pretending that an international convention that has been repeatedly sabotaged by its most powerful members might produce a bold or ambitious result is not a hopeful thing. In fact, it's just the opposite, undermining the positive impact of all the other climate messaging. Some of it, like the passionate youth climate movement or the accelerating pressure on institutions to divest from climate-wrecking assets at odds with their stated missions, truly bold and truly ambitious. So, this piece is highlighting for us just how much this COP event, which Thunberg was at the early stage of her career co-opted, assimilated into, is actually hindering global climate movements by centering itself as the forefront of such a thing while continuously giving empty promises and using empty rhetoric. These COPs and other global agreements that world leaders made delivered these huge promises based on market reforms, let's say. The Paris agreements operated off an assumption that as long as renewable energy production increased, good, and electric vehicle production increased, good, then the demand for gas-fueled vehicles would die out, oil-based assets would become stranded, and renewable energy would win the day. The markets are going to save the planet, actually. What an idea! Of course, it didn't work out that way. Is anybody shocked? I'm going to cite this article again that I mentioned in the Biden video from a few months ago. The energy scholar Phases writes in his crucial article on energy transition projections on how such projections were dubious, if not wittingly fraudulent, the output of economists and market analysts who are bought off by capital. He starts the article off by talking about the confidence that we have towards the Paris Agreement and the pledges of it that are basically based on data from projections that ultimately are flawed, actually not just flawed, are complete bunk. Again, it's this idea. There's a growing in production of renewable energies and a growing in production of electric vehicles. So if electric vehicles are cheaper to make and if more people buy them, then we won't need fuel-based vehicles, right? It'll be over, right? Obviously, that's not how capitalism actually works. Phases writes, it should go without saying that economists and other market analysts are very bad at predicting the future, and especially the future of energy markets. He notes how wind and solar developers are already experiencing financial headwinds as a result of higher interest rates, putting financiers away from less bankable projects. For electric vehicles in the US, he notes how consumer interest had already tapered off by the end of 2023, and new models have already become delayed or entirely canceled as the market sees the end of the early adopter stage much sooner than anticipated. And this is written in early 2024, so during the Biden administration, he writes how US oil is seeing yet another boom, and this one is actually profitable. In turn, the country is producing more oil than ever under the helm of the most climate-conscious president in its history. Now, he says further, it would be one thing if analysts made these bullshit forecasts without much consequence, but most of these people retain very high degrees of influence among policymakers, becoming speakers at government-sponsored summits, consultants for things like the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, and authors of DOE-funded research reports. Hence, their impact in shaping discourse of mainstream climate politics is monumental. And in kind of the same point that Lederer makes for N+1, he writes that these reports are intended to underwrite confidence in climate policies advertised to the public and in turn undermine any justification for more radical alternatives. You see the game here. He mentions, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, passed under the Biden administration. The Center for American Progress touted the bill as putting the U.S. on track to reclaiming the mantle of global climate leadership. Rhodium Group's assessment hailed the bill as a turning point for U.S. climate progress, and Josh Bivens at the Economic Policy Institute wrote that while far from perfect, the IRA finally gave the U.S. a real climate change policy. Fucking the bar is in hell, even for these people who are supposed to be hyping this stuff up. So Phases notes this analyst's report that the IRA is expected to dramatically impact the downward slope of the country's annual greenhouse gas emissions. But he calls this projection tenuous, and that it's unreliable as a proxy for decarbonization. He does so by asking us a question. Why were carbon emissions reducing under Obama? One thing that gets cited a lot is the fuel efficiency standards program that the Obama administration instituted. He writes, no doubt this was significant, at least early on, but it had an important and much less advertised side effect. Footprint-based efficiency standards incentivize the manufacturing of more profitable, larger gas-guzzling vehicles, such as trucks and SUVs, over lighter passenger cars. Hi, this is Elliot from the future, because Elliot from the past definitely did not understand what fuel efficiency is. Fuel efficiency is essentially the measurement of how efficiently a car uses fuel, meaning how much fuel the car needs based on how much it travels. What happened with the fuel efficiency standards that Obama passed was that they had something called a footprint rule. There was a curve of how much fuel efficiency a car required based on how big it was. So yeah, fuel efficiency standards were improved all across the board. All cars had to use less fuel to do the same functions. But a small car was expected to use much less fuel. That's what the footprint rule means. Because the car is smaller, you're expected to use much less fuel on it based on the footprint of the car itself, right? Physically. So what this tells companies is, okay, let's produce the biggest cars then, because then we don't have to meet the most rigorous fuel efficiency standards. And also the biggest cars are the most expensive, and that way we can profit the most across the board. So all this ended up doing was promoting car companies to make more and more SUVs, more and more large vehicles, pickup trucks, to where the percentage is just absurd now. So at first you see a benefit in carbon emissions from these fuel efficiency standards being passed, but not only did that flatten out over time based on the production of more and more gas-guzzling vehicles relatively, but this overall has a negative impact actually, because now we have more and more gas-guzzling vehicles than ever. Phases notes that in addition to being a primary cause of rising pedestrian fatalities, this has also flattened the growth of gains in fuel efficiency. So that's one of the ideas. So that's one of the things that the Obama administration did in their super liberal, super pro-environment policy. It ended up causing more and more bigger cars that guzzle more and more fuel. But that's not the only thing. He notes that the other significant source of decline in US emissions was, of course, the fracking boom. Infamously, President Obama had congratulated himself for this glowing achievement in the name of America's energy independence. While the key effect of this with respect to emissions was the decommissioning of more carbon-intensive coal plants, it would be absurd to suggest that the 2010s downward slope will continue at the same rate for the next 3 decades. For while relatively cleaner than coal, gas-fueled plants still emit carbon dioxide and hence still add fresh supplies of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. More than this, in fact, the proliferation of natural gas in the United States has led to extraordinary and largely unchecked pipeline and facility leakages of its predominant compound, methane, which is capable of trapping 28 times more heat than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period, and 80 times more heat over a 20-year period. So it turns out that trying to tackle climate change by, using less fuel or using less coal plants, but also at the same time trying to address your energy independence so that you can rely on your own country for producing more energy and boost more energy producers in your own country, give them more profits. It turns out that those contradictions end up not being very good for the climate. In fact, it might be even worse now. 1 year out, what do we see? In addition to the country producing more oil and gas than ever, the domestic LNG industry is absolutely booming, exporting an all-time monthly high of 8.6 million tons in December 2023. That's the thing. They're lying to us about understanding how to both make economic changes for the better and also make the planet safer and healthier. They're lying to us. They don't fundamentally understand how their own systems of economy actually work, or at least they pretend not to. They reduce the amount of cost it would take to produce renewable energy, and they boost more companies that produce electric vehicles. Sure, fine. But these things don't actually appeal to the producers, the people with the most money who you rely on economically in your country. What they do is, in fact, incentivize further and further for them to destroy the environment further and further because they're not supposed to care about the environment. And they're not supposed to care about their government's program. You don't have any way to check them or regulate them. What they care about is profit. Faces writes that the idea that markets move to the cheapest inputs presents a fundamental misunderstanding of the economic drivers of any supposed energy transition under capitalism. What matters is not cheapness, but profitability. While there is no doubt that green capitalists have been able to reduce costs of solar and wind energy over the past 20 years, this fact alone does not tell us anything about whether or not it is more profitable to do so. So this is the environment that soaked up Greta Thunberg, that made her a hero. These are the people that put her on that pedestal, whether it was the media companies that they owned, whether it was the United Nations committees that they led. It was all this farce, and Greta Thunberg became aware of that. This is eventually what radicalizes Greta against the UN climate conferences and the world system. This was how Greta Thunberg realized, especially after the beginning of the COVID crisis, that the entire movement she was a part of had been co-opted by a scam.
As it is now, the COPs are not designed to really change anything. That's not why they exist. And right now, it's like they are being turned into an opportunity for big polluters to greenwash themselves. The way that COP27 would, for me, be considered a success or a step forward would be that more people realize what a scam it actually is under current circumstances.
It is the sufferings of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few. And if solutions within this system are so impossible to find, then maybe we should change the system itself.
When she burst out onto the scene, she was a 15-year-old, okay? She understood that the profit motive was a big problem, but she was also just trying to make her voice heard, to boost the profile of this movement as much as possible. And I remind you, she was 15. So she gets these offers from the United Nations and these different companies. Hey, come aboard. We're also trying to do something about the climate. She worked within the system, and it brought her theoretically to the top. She became the perfect image of a non-violent activist, an example of the kind of change maker that capitalism will reward. Which is to say, someone who doesn't change much of anything other than rhetoric. And this is how Greta fell off. As soon as she became an adult and saw with her own eyes how fraudulent the world system was, how adults around her, from Swedish social media upstarts to world leaders at the UN, had merely used her to give the appearance of progressivism and awareness while laundering business as usual, she struck back against that system. All of a sudden, you're not seeing the UN post videos about Greta anymore. You're not seeing her giving TED Talks anymore. Time magazine, which had several pieces on Greta leading up to and immediately following their nomination of her as Person of the Year for their magazine, has run exactly 3 written pieces on Greta since 2021. And a couple of small-ass videos on their pitiful YouTube channel too. What are the articles that Time magazine is writing about this person now? A small section from her 2023 book, The Climate Book. Then there was a piece that was actually about Davos, which, if you don't know, is basically when all the rich evil people meet every year, which contains a section mentioning Greta Thunberg's letter, signed by other climate activists, towards the conference and its rich attendees who are leading the destruction of the planet. Again, not even a full article, a section of the article that was ultimately about Davos. And finally, a 2-minute article from 2023 explaining Greta Thunberg's arrest at a climate protest in Germany. This is all Time magazine can muster for its 2019 Person of the Year. As a neutral, right, and if you don't know what's going on, you must look at this and think, damn, what a bust. She's the Anthony Bennett of youth activism. When we look at Google Trends, we see coverage and discussion of Greta has apparently dropped off over time, only peaking again in 2022 when she had that one clapback at Andrew Tate. God, remember that? So, what has Greta been doing all this time anyway? Why is she flopping so bad? Did she just decide to go back to school? Is telling world leaders that they should be ashamed of themselves all that she ever does? Well, let's do some research and find out. In early 2022, she protested Swedish mining on Sami land, stating that the Swedish government needs to stop the colonization of the Sami. In early 2022 and the summer of 2023, she began denouncing the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an ecocide, meeting with President Zelensky in one of her few events receiving media coverage since 2021. In late 2022, she published the aforementioned Climate Book, which compiled work from over 100 experts. And then there was the aforementioned coal mine protest and arrest in Germany. In October 2023, she protested the Energy Intelligence Forum in the UK, an event referred to as the Oscars of Oil, after which she was arrested. A couple of days later, after events, she spoke out in solidarity with Palestine, which got her a ton of pushback. There was even some fucking controversy about a doll that she was holding, which was apparently anti-Semitic. That, of course, was nonsense. And Thunberg has only doubled and tripled down on her solidarity with Palestine in the time since.
I have lost many friends, and I have been called all imaginable stuff on the internet in every possible place, but I was already being that before, But I think if you as an activist aren't uncomfortable, I think you're doing something wrong. We aren't here to be people pleasers. We are here to say that, okay, this is messed up and we need to do something about it.
This has included protests of Eurovision in which she was detained. Barely Bitchy actually has a great new video about Eurovision and its linkages with Israel. She boycotted COP29 and called out its greenwashing as well as its location in Azerbaijan, whitewashing the country's complicity in genocide of Armenians. As part of this boycott, she went to Georgia, wherein she worked with protesters in Tbilisi against the right-wing authoritarian Georgian Dream government. She has protested and repeatedly fundraised for the Democratic Republic of Congo, particularly in Sweden against Swedish capital. She has publicly stood against human rights abuses of women in Balochistan by the Pakistani government. And in 2025 so far, she has visited and stood with Western Saharan activists facing aggressive colonization from the government of Morocco. So that's what she's been doing. Once Greta struck back at fake climate action and began to focus her activism on anti-capitalism and colonialism as a whole, recognizing that the same people who destroy our environment commit genocide and extract slave labor from the global poor for the same reasons, through the same processes, the media no longer covered her. New clips of her only go viral when the right wing shares them to harass and disparage her in the comments. She does not get nearly as much coverage from the supposedly left-leaning and centrist media entities like NBC or CBS or CNN or Reuters or AP. And let's be clear here, that shit wasn't doing anything. If you paid any attention to the past 10-20 minutes where I was talking about how facetious the climate action and the climate rhetoric was from the mainstream media and from the organizations that she was working with, you know that the end result is essentially the same. She's also not invited on talk shows nearly as often, and when she is, it's strictly to talk about climate. But focusing on climate without talking about politics is like focusing on food without talking about ingredients. It's just a really bad dish. I don't know. It needs something. Something has to change in the making of this dish. I don't want to talk about ingredients. We all know that we have different opinions on that. But this is not an ingredient issue. It's an issue of food. And food affects all of us. I will say, whoever is in charge of the making of this dish, you got to do a better job. How? You just have to cook better, be smarter in the kitchen, and frankly, we all as consumers of this dish have to do better, really. Unfortunately, many people are still not exposed to things outside of mainstream media and mainstream apolitical narratives, meaning they don't know what's going on, and their only exposure to activism is through channels that show it without context, which make it look useless. So when Greta starts talking about Gaza, the reaction instantly becomes one of cynicism. She's just an opportunist. She's looking for the next grift to hop on. There's no analysis of the correlation other than something being political and something else not being political. Friends, this is how anti-intellectualism works. That one friend that's too woke TikTok and its ensuing usage all over Twitter discourse has perhaps grown too much in power. It's like the new version of the I ain't reading all that meme, or the it's not that deep, that type of stuff. Things start as innocent jokes, but they take off because they resonate with the type of anti-intellectualism that predominates in popular culture. And this anti-intellectualism is very convenient for business as usual to proceed, or for things to get more and more conservative. We are obviously seeing a war on woke in mainstream politics led by the MAGA crowd and by the subset of anti-trans, anti-communist Democrats and even the MAGA communists, whatever they're doing. Some feel the Democrats' failures are a result of going too far left. I don't know how you get that idea. Kamala Harris was literally running to the right of Donald Trump on the border and would refuse to talk about trans issues other than we're gonna follow the law, and was absolutely 100% backing the genocide in Gaza. And somehow I'm convinced that not only was she too far left, but that also if I am, somebody of a woke persuasion, that she is one of my heroes, that I'm supposed to listen to her when she talks to me about how she told us so. You're the thing that you should have been warning us about. This topic has been debated to death though, and yet I feel a key component is missing here, which Greta Thunberg's case helps us to notice. That is the aggressive depoliticization of people, especially in the global north. You can say it all starts from the post-war Red Scare, the exiling and ridiculing of prominent intellectuals and communist celebrities like Paul Robeson, Leonard Bernstein, and W.E.B. Du Bois in the United States. Or perhaps it starts with the neoliberal era, which paired violent repression in places like Chile with violent repression of intellectual radical movements like the Black Panthers. All this time later, we have this wonderful environment where it's seen as extraordinary that celebrities should say anything about politics at all, wherein supporting basic progressive ideas like, hey, black people, their lives matter, or I'm against genocide, or trans people deserve to have human rights is something that should be a massive statement that we should all stand up and applaud. to the point where it's even bold for us to say these basic things on social media or in hangouts with friends. God forbid we hang out with friends and we talk about politics. Ajay Singh Chaudhary, in his book Exhausted of the Earth, which I'll speak about forever on this channel because I really think it's extremely useful, points to mass depoliticization wherein neoliberalism colonizes the time for politics. Through the constant emphasis on the individual, something we touch on in our solidarity video, and one's productivity not only at work, but in the house as a skill learner or a health haver, as well as one's productivity as a consumer, as a social media user who builds timelines brick by brick, a person who buys the best products for the best value because they've been doing their research, or who maintains a good credit score to show that they're the best at buying and saving. No one is given time to be deep. No one is given time for the deep, scary work of thinking about where all this money comes from and where it goes as soon as it leaves our fingers. And that's not even to mention the constant consent manufacturing of the media, because people, even when they say they don't like the news media, they don't like mainstream media, they still pay attention to it. They still get swayed so much by it. You're meant to rely on these people to learn about what's going on outside your door without the politics, as if a class of elites that buy that media and control its messaging don't have any political intentions at all. It's through all this stuff that Greta Thunberg becomes an easy villain. She's too woke. Greta, of course, has received pushback loudly from right-wing spheres who think that the fact she talks about climate crisis and also genocide means she's obviously a grifter. We've mentioned that. One can observe many viral videos and news media comment sections on this website for evidence of that. What I think people are missing here, though, is that not only can you absolutely be both against the destruction of the environment and genocide, but that both of these things are very interconnected. And this brings us to the other, quieter pushback that Greta receives. I don't know if I have the strength in me to read this Reddit post, but here's a bit of a sample. So it's a post shared on r/climate about how Greta Thunberg is using the climate movement to throw her support behind the Palestinians. Top comment: I don't think people in this sub appreciate what a strategic error it is to attach the climate movement to other activist causes. If the movement is going to meld with a side in the Israel-Palestine conflict, me when I'm in a conflict with the person who's robbing my house, one of the most politically divisive topics on the planet, it will never achieve its goals, period. I like when liberals say period to make it sound like they're making a point, even though they're really not. We all think the climate emergency is the most pressing problem in the world, right? If that's true, it should transcend every other issue because they all, regional conflicts included, pale in comparison to what's coming and currently occurring. All this does is mire the climate movement in the politics of other problems, making it impossible to get anything meaningful accomplished. We're screwed. I get so frustrated with that, but I also get it. I get it, right? We've been sold this idea that the climate crisis is some universal issue. But it's not. The climate crisis is not a universal issue. It is not affecting all of us proportionately. It is not something that rises above political conflicts. It is a political conflict. It is being done to us. It is specific people, poor people in the global south, poor people in Latin America, poor people in the Pacific, poor people in Vanuatu, poor people in Nauru who are being affected by this shit. It is poor people in North Carolina that are suffering from the effects of devastating climate crises. It is poor people in Texas. It is poor people around the world. This is not something that's happening to rich people. It's not something that's going to bring us all together. I have news for people. Rich people are preparing for the climate crisis. Rich people, right-wingers, conservatives, are preparing for the climate crisis. They're not ignorant that it's happening. They know that it's happening. Many of them will get wiped out. There are many Trump voters who will get devastated by voting for Trump and the effects of his election. But many people will also benefit, and they knew that they were going to benefit. Many people are going to make a lot of money off of the Trump administration, and that's why they voted for Trump. Many people are going to make a lot of money off of the climate crisis, or at the very least are going to make a ton of money in the meantime, as long as possible, and then pivot as much as possible to hiding away from the rest of civilization, or towards holding resources that are vital for the rest of our populations as much as possible so that we don't kill them. But we look at politics as this matter of different battlegrounds wherein we can either win or lose. So it would make some sense then to just focus on one particular issue, one particular battleground, and just try to win there instead of getting messy and making it all interconnected. But we don't make it all interconnected. Greta Thunberg is not making climate and Gaza interconnected. They already are. You are the one who is causing more problems by not recognizing that. And this puts aside even the moral question of calling a spade and calling a genocide a genocide. Why is it so hard to read a book? Why is it so hard to read the long history of Israel and Palestine? Why is it so hard to even read the new historians in Israel who will sit here and tell you that the entire foundation for their country, especially its military dominance, is a lie that is perpetuated on settler colonialism? Why is it so hard for you to do that? Why are you so attached to this idea that you can be uncontroversial, like nobody's gonna dislike you if you just focus on all the popular things and you avoid ever being controversial? Why do you think that's gonna work? People hate you anyway. You might as well say something of substance. The book Exhausted of the Earth does tremendous work to highlight just how political climate change is. Chaudhary does this in many ways. One, by rejecting the outdated idea that the right wing simply denies climate change exists. The evidence now is that Democrat and Republican voters both believe we should invest in renewable energies and engage in climate change effect reduction. The stats are there, people. The thing is, Republicans think it's a lot smaller of an issue and that we should go a lot slower. But they both believe we should do something. By and large, the people who think climate change isn't real, they're more and more of an irrelevant minority by the day. This is when we have to talk about right-wing climate realism, the real force behind trying to propagate Greta Thunberg as a savior, ultimately failing, and now pivoting to all types of other projects. Chaudhary is the one who coins the term right-wing climate realism and describes it as such. The idea of right-wing climate realism can strike many as odd in the first instance. The assumption runs climate change is universal since we can turn to a scientistic politics. There is only really one climate realism, and the primary task is to communicate, persuade, and teach the science from which the one true politic will emerge. All that stands in the way of this is the intransigence of non-believers. This is perhaps ironically a familiar story. It is a Christian story of gospel and evangelism. But the science does not have a single politics. Right-wing climate realism is in its simplest form a political ecological scenario of the concentration, preservation, and enhancement of existing political and economic power. What does this mean? Let's get into some examples. Chaudhary also coins a term called the Rex position, which is named after Rex Tillerson, CEO of ExxonMobil from 2006 to 2016 and Secretary of State under Donald Trump for parts of 2017-2018. Tillerson famously proclaimed, "My philosophy is to make money. If I can drill and make money, then that's what I want to do." Tillerson is not a climate denier per se, he just doesn't share the urgency of his many critics. People will adapt to climate change. There are engineering solutions. And there are many clear and bright futures for business as usual in the meantime. He uses this Rex position as something that is basically not a single politics, but is a shared quality of many different types of right-wing politics that are emerging around the world, that are combining both concern with climate change and also extremely fascist ideologies. In January 2020, the right-wing People's Party of Austria entered into a new governing alliance with Austria's Green Party. Goals of renewable energy by 2040 and investment in efficient, clean, and modernized public transportation were married to preventative detention of migrants and expansions of internal restrictions on Muslims in order to protect both the climate and its borders. While the coalition still holds, the ultra-right Freedom Party, with its own roots in classical Nazi environmentalism, leads upcoming polls. From the French National Rally with its own explicit fascist roots, now blending romantic environmentalism and Heideggerian rootedness with more contemporary sounding arguments that borders are the environment's greatest ally. It is through them that we will save the planet. To the Swiss People's Party, currently the largest in Swiss parliament, arguing if you want to effectively protect the environment in Switzerland, you must fight mass immigration. Green really is the new black. And this isn't just something that applies to people that liberals are comfortable calling fascists. It applies to liberals too, because as we know from everything in history, liberals are what facilitate fascism. It can be difficult to tell the difference, Chaudhary writes, between an eco-fascist manifesto and a liberal New York Times columnist commenting that we have a real immigration crisis. The solution is a high wall with a big gate, but a smart gate. What the hell does that mean? Okay, what it means is we're allowing in desirables and we're kicking out undesirables. And that's how we deal with climate crises, not by preventing them. Never that, because that would cause us to strand trillions of dollars in assets and change the entire economic order. No, the way we'll deal with climate change is by allowing as many climate crises to occur while maintaining enough of a workforce as possible and getting rid of enough undesirables as possible. That way we can maintain power over the people that survive. It is, as Chaudhary writes, similar visions of the preservation of power and security for a select few whose primary difference is intensity and audience. Superstorm Sandy strikes New York and the lights remain on at Goldman Sachs, which, like the new luxury developments, has its own internal power generation system. So both the far right and the centrists globally are using climate change as a means to make a lot of money for people who produce energy domestically, to cement anti-immigration programs, and to make money off of all types of crisis prevention businesses, like insurance if your house gets burned down in California. All of this while having no urgency to stop drilling, to continue to drill baby drill, because there's no need to regard the lives of humans that are gonna die yet. We don't care about those humans yet. Those are the undesirables. We keep doing the bad climate stuff now because we're okay with the amount of people it will kill. We have decided that the way to fight climate change is to keep everyone in our borders and to keep them reproducing like rabbits under old school ideas of gender. Yeah, so you see how the trans politics and the queer politics stuff matters here too? And low-hanging fruit, right? But just to hammer home how related the issues of genocide and climate crisis are, we need not look any further than the environmental costs of bombing Gaza. From 972 Mag, in June, the Center for Applied Environmental Diplomacy at the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies published an extensive new report on the environmental impact of Israel's ongoing assault on Gaza. The report covers myriad environmental harms of the war, from the vast amount of toxic dust released by bombing buildings to the breakdown of waste management and the destruction of water treatment facilities and proliferation of waterborne illnesses. The report also highlights the link between armed conflict and global warming. On July 21st, the planet experienced the hottest day on record. In the Middle East, temperatures are rising on average twice as fast as the rest of the world. By April, this is from Dr. Mariam Abdel-Hay, the destruction of buildings throughout the Gaza Strip had produced an estimated 37 million tons of debris. As buildings are damaged or collapse, they release clouds of noxious smoke, toxic dust, and fumes into the environment. Back to Reddit for a second. Please, climate friends, do you not see how horrible it is to tie the already contentious climate movement to the politically chaotic and extremely divisive Palestinian issue? Fuckers. Perhaps we should be a little bit less worried about keeping things orderly and nice, and more worried about actually fighting the causes of climate change, which are the same causes of all the other issues around the world, okay? A group of billionaires destroying and exhausting all life on Earth, from humans to soils, from animal life to minerals. Chaudhary's concept of the extractive circuit demonstrates this reality really well. The machinery, the actual form and function of 21st century capitalism is an extractive circuit which quite literally crisscrosses the world. The extractive circuit is the leaden reality of a global human ecological niche organized for maximal profitability, no matter how difficult or costly to maintain. Feelings of exhaustion, depression, desperation, fatigue, exasperation course through its wirings, neurons, biochemicals, and sinews.
Some people say that I should study to become a climate scientist so that I can solve the climate crisis. But the climate crisis has already been solved. We already have all the facts and solutions. All we have to do is to wake up and change.
Because of the media coverage that Greta Thunberg and the climate crisis have received, It makes sense, frustrating as it is, that folks like the Emergency Intercom podcast would think that she fell off, okay? Or that folks would think her current work is irrelevant to the climate. But what's encouraging is seeing how many people speak up. I know we're in a position to feel as cynical as ever, given the state of civil rights in the United States and repression by both parties, given the ongoing economic warfare being waged in the US by billionaires and their hired gun politicians. But the detainment and deportation of Mahmoud Khalil, harrowing as it is one, not new in US history. It is legally based in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. And two, indicative of how much the ruling class is scared of your free speech. They took TikTok away and tried to Trumpify it because of how effective it was at radicalizing young people against Israel. They stomped out encampments. They waged media wars, even against celebrities who promote pro-Palestine messages. You think Hollywood people want to be defending Gal Gadot this much? They know she's a bad actor just like the rest of us.
Kalel, no!
They wouldn't do all this if they thought it had no impact on them. Your speech, and therefore your education on politics, matters. Don't let anyone tell you that calling out influencers and celebrities for regressive politics is useless. It's not. It only becomes useless when you approach it in a shallow way, looking for engagement on social media or trying to win stan wars for your favored parasocial relationship. In fact, this is something I spoke about with Ajay Singh Chaudhary on my Patreon. Yes, I got to talk to the author of Exhausted of the Earth, which gives me more incentive to talk about that book even more than I already was.
Right? Whether I'm talking about either of these tendencies, the level of repression is over the fucking top. But that's also, I know that can be scary, but also people should keep in mind, that's because the whole thing is rickety.
Yeah.
The other thing that's really interesting about the global system, and we saw this a lot during the pandemic, we've seen it with things like the intense focus, for example, on shipping lanes right now and things of this nature. Everything is built to such a degree of sort of like razor thin efficiency and structure, like to cost out the absolute maximum profit, that everything's really brittle. And it's almost like counterintuitive. And I don't want people to misunderstand me because I am horrified and disgusted by the repression and suppression that is happening in our country and others right now. But it's also a sign they're scared of you. It's a sign that people actually are taking you very, very seriously.
Yeah.
And I will say, I think student Palestine activists are facing the brunt of this, but also are the people who are showing the powers that be that, in fact, there is a limit and people will push back.
Speech, of course, is not the only thing that matters. Direct action and mutual aid matter. Road blockages and property destruction matter. And that's the most I'll say about that, or about this guy. But speech is something that we all actually can still do. And not just because our First Amendment rights are actually being respected in this country, but because it is a useful tool for us to utilize to continue building community, to continue urging people away from mindless consumption and business as usual, and towards voting campaigns, boycotts, unions, and stuff that maybe isn't so legal. Greta Thunberg's case also shows us that speech can be co-opted. Make no mistake, as much as Greta reached a turning point and radicalized further after COVID, she was always against capitalism. Even as a 15-year-old girl, in that How Dare You speech, the famous one, that was portrayed as anger towards boomers or whatever, Greta said clearly,
"And all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?"
Now, we all know what it's like to be co-opted, okay? And when you talk politics, it can't really be avoided. I'm co-opted by YouTube, by sponsors, by Patreon, and whatever bots can reach my comment section the fastest to comment something as quickly as possible. Never you though, Pokraj Roy. We're a big fan of you. We're a big fan of Pokraj Roy on this channel. What we can do though is take care to say what's true and not get overly caught up in how we are interpreted. Greta Thunberg is no stranger to bad faith interpretation. Check the comments of almost any of her most famous clips now, especially ones shared by dubious popular news networks that get rated by right-wingers on YouTube and TikTok. Like the blah 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 speech. It's full of trolls that are like, oh, all she's saying is blah, blah, blah. People are applauding. Look at where society is nowadays. People have no understanding of rhetoric, right? Or people who are like, oh, she only scolds people without offering solutions. As if that's really true, given how she advocates for people to, especially world leaders, listen to the scientific recommendations by the scientific community. As if she doesn't say that the profit motive is clearly the driver of these issues.
And yet somehow these are the people that we seem to rely on solving our problems, where they have proven time and time again that they are not prioritizing that. They are prioritizing self-greed, corporate greed, and short-term economic profits.
And more often than not, of course, just plain misogyny and ageism towards a young woman who has done nothing except ask world leaders and rich people to stop being evil. She could have sailed quietly into the night after taking a position that sounds meaningful, a vice chair at XYZ committee, a recurring writer at XYZ publication, doing such and such as a New York Times bestseller. But she chose instead to call people out. Okay, she continuously calls people out and builds a huge platform through which solidarity and education can be built across continents. We often think of success today as a big institution endorsing you, as big money backing you, as big media covering you. And we often think criticism has to meet 1,000 conditions. You have to be respectful and meek so as to not make people feel like they're being canceled. And you have to offer several carefully considered solutions for people who haven't given any thought to the thing you're raising attention to. But Greta Thunberg is an inspiration because she speaks to how futile both of those things are. The reactions, of course, to the emergency intercom's faux pas have been split. They did issue an apology later on. They seem to feel really bad about it. And where there was a massive pushback against their comments, there also has been a movement, mostly from within their fan base, to downplay this ignorance.
I hate the left. I hate it so much. I am now a reactionary conservative. It makes me lose my fucking mind. You parasocial cringe lords.
You know the type of stuff we're talking about here. It's just a joke. Why are you taking these influencers so seriously? They're always joking all the time. Obviously, they don't know how to educate themselves. They're not world leaders. Why are you looking to them to have all the political solutions? Shut the fuck up. It's 2025. My God, we're still doing this. We're still babying these people who are fucking grown adults. Nobody is asking Drew and Enya to lead a labor strike or to write a dense philosophical book about eco-socialism. They are simply being asked to care a bit more about who they talk about. If straight white guys like George Carlin and Bill Burr can be universally seen as funny and respected by pointing out social issues and not shitting on activists or marginalized groups, then I think a couple of Gen Z queer folks can do the same. The world is exhausted, the crises are heightening, and things need to change. Do not let people convince you with buzzwords and out-of-context screenshots and misreadings and trendy phrases that thinking too much or speaking too much are out of fashion. Do not let society scare you into hiding yourself. Force them to hide you instead. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our Patreon. And thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video.
But as long as we treat the climate crisis as a side topic or as a political issue among other political issues and so on, and do not see it as the emergency it is, and as long as we do not connect that crisis to many other interconnected crises, the more time we would lose. If we just keep pretending that we can solve this crisis by having a new government, for example, then that's not really realizing the full extent of this emergency. So we have to keep pushing in every possible way.